Yeah. So the fundamental thesis, the top level thesis is that AI, I think, is poised to do to our agency and autonomy what Google Maps has done to our sense of direction, right? We have handed over our ability to navigate the world, literally, to a guidance system, Google Maps, such that these days I have trouble finding my way around my own neighborhood. I use Google Maps no matter where I'm going. And that's, and occasionally I'll turn it off just to sort of challenge myself. And I inevitably get a little bit lost because I've just given up on navigating like I used to. And as we see this technology evolve, and I wrote this at a time when transformer models had just come online. So the transformer models, which are the ones that make it possible for huge amounts of data to be turned into these sort of pattern-based lessons that make LLMs possible. When I was thinking about what AI and those transformer models might make possible, I was talking to all of these fledgling people, early people at OpenAI and others who were saying, we're going to make these assistants that are going to be perfect for humans and anticipate their needs. And the more I looked at that, and then simultaneously looked at the ways in which our choices are so pattern based and so unconscious, and then you layer on top of that one of the big lessons of behavioral science, which is that human beings do not want to make our own choices if we don't have to. We outsource huge amounts of our decision making to our environment, to our emotions. The whole lesson of the last 50 years of behavioral science is we are just shortcut machines. We do not want to think a thing through raw. We want to follow the shortcut whenever we possibly can, because that's how we've stayed alive in our lives. As a species. It's why we're, the ones who thought it through deeply are long dead. They're way back on the evolutionary ladder and they are gone because they took too long in thinking, oh, what kind of snake is that? Or, I don't know, are these berries ripe enough? Do I like these berries? Those people are dead because it's those of us who are like, yum, berries, and oh no, snake, run. That instinctive decision-making system is what has kept us alive as a species. It's a great evolutionary gift, but it also makes us the perfect target for companies that want to say, don't worry about this. Have the AI make the choice for you. And so that's the fundamental thesis.
Jacob, welcome to the show. To get started, can you tell us about the kind of key events that led you to studying the intersection of psychology and technology?
Sure. So I really appreciate you having me here. And I was a sort of straight up the middle technology correspondent for a long time. So I was the editor-in-chief of a magazine called Popular Science. And I did various stints at magazines like Wired. I was Al Jazeera's technology correspondent. And then I got to do a PBS series called Hacking Your Mind that came out. PBS is our big national broadcaster here. And they, I did a 4-hour series about how the human beings make decisions and the sort of patterns of our decisions. So anybody who's read Thinking Fast and Slow is kind of a famous book in that world. A guy named Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics for his work on this. And there's a whole world, it turns out, of behavioral scientists who basically are figuring out the patterns by which we make mistakes, usually under time pressure or lacking resources or lacking information. We tend to make very similar mistakes in a wide range of situations. So I was learning about all of that, and that was very personally transformative. At the end of that, I quit drinking, and all kinds of things in my life were transformed by understanding just how automatic our choices are. And at the same time, in my tech journalism job, I was learning about all of these companies and sort of fledgling entrepreneurs who were trying to use what were at the time some pretty primitive AI models to gather up as much data about how we make decisions as possible, and not only monitor human behavior, but if they could shape it, right? Which is what the whole lesson of social media was as an industry, you can make tons of money dealing in human behavior. And so, I went to this particular dinner party once where a couple of addiction experts were standing at the front of the room and telling this group of entrepreneurs, hey, we can make your products as addictive as possible. And here are all of the ways that addiction research shows us that we can ensnare your customers without you realizing. That company was literally these two PhDs from USC who had just learned all they had about addiction. They were going to put it to use in this way. And they were calling themselves Dopamine. That was the name of the consultancy. And I just remember sitting there at that time, I was in a kind of a gritty part of San Francisco. We were in this funny sort of loft studio place, and I knew that all around us were all of these people suffering from heroin and fentanyl addictions, in that part of the town. And I'd been spending a lot of time reporting on that. I'd had this big experience on PBS, and then I was listening to these people very cavalierly saying, we can use addiction to basically trick people into using these products really well. And as I learned about the ways in which AI was going to be able to make pattern recognition so easy, and I was learning about how science had taught us how pattern-based we were, honestly, I don't want to swear on your podcast, but I was like, fuck, this is a real problem. This is a real problem. And here it comes. And so I set out to do this book to try and warn people about it. I thought I was very early in writing this book, The Loop. And it turns out like ChatGPT came out like 9 months after it was published, and now here we are.
It's hard to believe that, those two guys stood up there and quite openly just shared, here's what we know about addiction, and here's how you can apply this to get people hooked on your products for profit. It's unbelievable. Your father had a background in studying the history of colonialism and slavery. Can you tell us about the impact this had on you as well?
Oh, this is great. It gives me goosebumps to be asked about my parents. Yeah, my folks were a very unusual duo in a few ways. So my mom was a nurse and then an academic, and anyone who has come up through nursing has learned a great deal about how the world works and what is. How power works, how systems affect people's health, all sorts of things. And so, and she's an extremely sophisticated systems thinker about that kind of stuff, and went on to run a nursing school and was and so she sort of set the stage for me of sort of thinking about sort of the word in nursing is doing the needful, like what is important in life and what is not, what's crap and what's important work. And so I was always sort of raised with that. And then my father was a couple of amazing things. One, he was a stay-at-home dad, which in 1974 was a really unusual thing. And so I grew up in an environment where the professional power dynamic was reversed from all of my friends' families. I was used to the idea that your dad is the one who does bedtime and makes all the dinners and, gives you your bath and all of that stuff. And so and he also is a historian of slavery and of colonialism. He grew up in India for a big chunk of his childhood, just when the British had left, and as a result was sort of an eyewitness to both the intense systemic racism that had made colonialism possible, but also as a personal experience, he was raised to basically believe that white people kind of didn't count. Like in that environment, that it was only Indians that were cool, and that they did all the cool stuff, and they were who had clout and power and cultural influence, and everybody, and he was used to sort of just being like not just irrelevant, but kind of part of a tradition of harm. And so for me, being raised by a guy like that, when that guy's giving you your bath each evening, you're learning about the role of power and oppression and inequality and the hegemony, and you're learning all that stuff. And so I grew up with this really unique opportunity to sort of see power in this different way and see class in this different way, and so it was very transformative. And so when I was then put into when I started doing technology and business journalism, I just couldn't help but look for like who has power here and who does not, and where is the power? How is the power being deployed, and how is it not? And for me, their influence, my parents' influence, was very powerful in creating this very specific lens through which I've been looking at all this stuff. And I think that's how I've arrived at this place where I'm mapping psychology and tech and money, but really it's power. power is really what I wind up covering all of the time, and their influence I think brought me there.
Yeah, I can see how having, like, they sound like amazing parents, but I can see how that would help to shape a really unique lens on the world and help you to see the world in the way that you do and look at topics in the way that you do. To sort of kick us off here, Jacob, can you give us the central thesis of the loop? What is this boil down, would you say?
Yeah. So the fundamental thesis, the top level thesis, is that AI, I think, is poised to do to our agency and autonomy what Google Maps has done to our sense of direction, right? We have handed over our ability to navigate the world, literally, to a guidance system, Google Maps, such that these days I have trouble finding my way around my own neighborhood. I use Google Maps no matter where I'm going. And that's, and occasionally I'll turn it off just to sort of challenge myself. And I inevitably get a little bit lost because I've just given up on navigating like I used to. And as we see this technology evolve, and I wrote this at a time when transformer models had just come online. So the transformer models, which are the ones that make it possible for huge amounts of data to be turned into these sort of pattern-based lessons that make LLMs possible. When I was thinking about what AI and those transformer models might make possible, I was talking to all of these fledgling people, early people at OpenAI and others who were saying, we're going to make these assistants that are going to be perfect for humans and anticipate their needs. And the more I looked at that, and then simultaneously looked at the ways in which our choices are so pattern based and so unconscious, and then you layer on top of that one of the big lessons of behavioral science, which is that human beings do not want to make our own choices if we don't have to. We outsource huge amounts of our decision making to our environment, to our emotions. The whole lesson of the last 50 years of behavioral science is we are just shortcut machines. We do not want to think a thing through raw. We want to follow the shortcut whenever we possibly can, because that's how we've stayed alive in our lives as a species. It's why we're, the ones who thought it through deeply are long dead. They're way back on the evolutionary ladder and they are gone because they took too long in thinking, oh, what kind of snake is that? Or, I don't know, are these berries ripe enough? Do I like these berries? Those people are dead because it's those of us who are like, yum, berries, and oh no, snake, run. That instinctive decision-making system is what has kept us alive as a species. It's a great evolutionary gift, but it also makes us the perfect target for companies that want to say, don't worry about this. Have the AI make the choice for you. And so that's the fundamental thesis.
Yeah, in the past, groups that had an authoritarian leader, or as a group, if you made a decision quickly and effectively and you just followed what the leader was saying, you were far more likely to survive than groups that would sort of sit and deliberate and question and all the rest. So that's who we're descended from, and we've all got this bias for authority. And from reading your work, it was kind of a bit concerning. It sort of made me think, are we in the early stages of paving the way for a really authoritarian society here? And then, I've seen a recent podcast episode you released from, or was on the question of whether or not we could trust Sam Altman.
Mm-hmm.
Could you just share your thoughts on this character, and to what extent can we trust this individual, do you think?
Yeah. So so when I think about the things that I predicted in the book and got right versus the things that I got wrong, I feel proud is the wrong word, because I wish I hadn't been right about any of this, but I was proud of understanding in advance that the temptation to make this thing irresistible and the irresistibility of it for us psychologically, I knew about that. What I didn't know was, first of all, how quickly people would buy into that, how quickly people would attach themselves to these systems, not just as sort of like, assistants, but, in some cases truly developing like relationships, romantic kind of connections to chatbots, as we're seeing across the world. So that was one thing I didn't know about. And the other thing I didn't know about was the kinds of people who would lead the charge around this stuff, and the zealotry, the near religious zealotry that they would bring to it. And Sam Altman is the sort of the cartoon version of that. He is a guy who has managed to raise ungodly amounts of money on a product that, on a business model that defies all math. Like, there is no way, according to any traditional measurements, that investors are ever going to get the money back, from his business model. And yet he has managed to convince the world to give him untold amounts of money and he's burning it at billions, by the billions, in the service of an ideal that he describes over and over again, which is this utopian future in which we're going to have much less work and much more creative satisfaction, and that the life is going to be better. It's truly a sort of cultist's premise. And what's really weird is the way in which he makes that promise while openly describing the destruction that what he and his industry are creating is going to have wrought on our jobs and our relationships and on cybersecurity. And he sort of sells the product in part by saying how dangerous and destructive the product is going to be. And so all of that is a very weird cocktail of stuff that I hadn't really seen coming. And so Karen Howe, the writer, did a wonderful book called Empire of AI that is a great inside look at OpenAI and how that company came to be and what Altman is like. And then more recently, The New Yorker, Andrew Marantz and Ronan Farrow at The New Yorker did a good look inside the November 2023 firing of Sam Altman for about 72 hours by his board. And one of the things that has come up in both of those accounts is this is a guy who makes huge promises and also tends to tell everybody, whoever's in the room at that time, exactly what they want to hear. So he speaks to, a guy like Dario Amodei or Andrei Karpathy, these guys that worked for him early on in the service of what he was assuring them would be a sort of safe and very ethical project, one that would be governed not like a normal business. Meanwhile, he's simultaneously trying to create, according to these accounts, a power center around himself that gives him the opportunity to run this thing like nobody else. And so for me, what the theme that I keep coming back to in the leadership of these organizations tends to be that these are folks who truly believe. I just think that they really believe that there is a set of people whose decisions count, and there's a set of people whose decisions do not. And the way I've seen this articulated is with a phrase that gets bandied about inside tech companies sometimes, which is NPC, which is a video game term for non-player character, NPC. And you say, and they will refer to people as being an NPC means they have no clout, they have no influence, they have no weight in the organization. And then they'll talk about agents. And this is a complimentary thing about a person being an agent, meaning that they have agency and power and influence. And NPCs don't count, basically. That's the video game thing. An NPC those are the grandmas you can run down in your car in Grand Theft Auto, right? It doesn't matter. And I think that there is both a kind of unexamined class hierarchy kind of idea that is in a lot of these guys' brains. And there's an assumption that all of the education benefits and resource benefits and so forth that they have enjoyed as they have come up in the world through the top universities and around the top people and blah, 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 that somehow all of the benefits of that will continue to accrue to future generations through this technology. When in fact, what we're seeing, and these guys just seem to be blind to this, is that they are literally replacing the benefits of education and emotional connection and critical, discovery and all of these things that they benefited from and that past generations have benefited from. They are doing away with that stuff in this very weird kind of experimental on the fly way that I don't think any of them have really thought through fully. And their attitude is the standard software attitude, which is just let's ship this thing and we'll fix it later, is the sort of software attitude. And yet they're doing immediate and I would argue possibly permanent damage to some really important human institutions in the process. So I don't think Altman's the only one like this. I think there's many, many people like this, but he's certainly an archetype of this kind of what I would consider a pretty cavalier attitude about this stuff, in spite of what he says in public.
Yeah, I wonder about this. I wonder if you reach a certain level of power and status in society, does it sort of give you the notion that you're exempt from the rest of the rules of the rest of the population? That seems to be a pattern, you know?
Yeah, I certainly would say that's the case. I mean, I think that there is a, there's a so I'll tell you a story that was a big one for me. So early in the days of image generation, I was interviewing a guy named David Holtz, who's the head of Midjourney, which is one of the big image generation AI systems. And I was asking him whether he felt responsible for all of the crazy stuff that people were making, including pictures of Trump in an orange jumpsuit, these sort of news quality images of imaginary things. And I was saying, do you feel like responsibility for this or responsibility for, any of the kind of, the theft of art, or like, what's your responsibility here? And he just sort of kept coming back to, well, we're just figuring it out. We're figuring it out. We're figuring it out. And then finally he sort of in some bit of frustration said, well, if I'm baking muffins for a living and 10,000 muffins, come out of my oven and one of them gives somebody food poisoning, am I supposed to stop baking muffins? And there's this long pause between us. And I was like, yeah, dude. Yeah, that's exactly what you're supposed to stop doing. Yeah, that's like, not only that, like in this country, the FDA, we don't regulate a lot, but we regulate that. Like the FDA is going to come to you and shut you down and make you figure out like where in your supply chain the problem is happening here. Like what are you talking about? And he clearly just sort of had come from this world in which the edge case, that rare instance in which food poisoning is a problem, is not really his problem because the overall benefit is so enormous in his mind. Then like 2 weeks later, I was at a bakery, a big industrial bakery. I just happened to be there for a different story. And the guy was showing me all this stuff. There's a place that makes, just endless amounts of bread for local grocery stores. And at the end of it, he showed me the last stop that all of his products make, which is they all go through a metal detector. And I was like, whoa, a metal detector? Why would you put all these croissants through metal detectors? And he's like, well, you've seen the factory floor. At some point, one of these nuts or washers or bolts is going to fall out of the machine and into the dough. And I can't have even one of those go out on a shelf. If anybody bites into one of my croissants and finds a metal washer in there, that's a totally unacceptable number. So of course I'm going to do this. And when I looked at this guy who was like, at Midjourney, who is about to like reprogram our ideas of what's true and what's not, like really is going to like rebuild reality around us basically. And then this dude who's in charge of breakfast, and the guy making the breakfast has such higher standards for himself than this other guy. I think there's some unexamined, I'm the most important person stuff that's going on. And there's the logic of software, which is the more of a thing you make, the better that thing becomes, because scale solves your problems in software. Whereas the croissant guy knows that the more croissants you put out there that have a problem in them, the worse your situation is. Hardware and all other businesses know you don't ship something that isn't ready to go. And so I think there's a cavalier quality that is both a function of how these folks were raised and who they are, and the business world that they came up through.
Yeah, it makes me think as well, like in the ideal world, and in the dream scenario, there would be some kind of checking system in place where the more power, money, status that you accrue in society, there would be some kind of way. Okay, so you're at this stage. You need to have also reached this stage of moral, psychological development to sort of ensure you're not going to abuse the situation you're in. But obviously that's dreamland kind of stuff. But one of the things I've heard Altman say is that one of his goals with ChatGPT or with what he's creating is he wants to create the first one-person billionaire, the one-person billionaire company.
Yeah.
And that says it all. It's about a concentration of power in a very, very small percentage of the population, which I can't see how that could be a good thing.
Well, I love speaking about this with you from with you sitting in Dublin, because I think that there's a long tradition in Irish culture and Irish politics of understanding the tipping point past which oppression becomes a thing, and the system of oppression becomes really put into place hard. And there's just I love that you see that, because what's amazing about that quote is I was literally just at a conference in which a guy was telling a story, was detailing all of the companies that are on the threshold of what Altman has described. So it's just for anybody who doesn't know, back in January of 2024, Altman said to Alexis Ohanian, who has a podcast, that he and his buddies, his tech CEO buddies, have a bet going as to when we'll see the first $1 billion one-person company, a one-person unicorn is what we would call it in the business world. And he obviously thinks of that as a good thing, like that, how cool that would be, how great that is, right? And in the conference I was just at, this guy was talking about all of these like 1- and 2-person companies that are starting to maybe even approach that. And you could hear all of the entrepreneurs in the room being like, oh, cool, that's sweet. Like there's this feeling of enthusiasm for that. And so I know I'm the one being interviewed here, but I want to ask you, like, given what you know about power, right? Given what you know about how fragile an economy can be, what was your reaction when you heard that? Do you think of that in any way as a good thing, or did you immediately go, "Oh no, that sounds like a real problem"?
It took a while for it to sink in, but then whenever I realized what he's talking about there, it's just like no good can come of that direction in society. Where power concentrates amongst a very, very small elite, and the rest of the people are sort of left out of that, like that.
Right, working the land they don't own. Right. I mean, that's literally the what we're talking about here. I mean, this is the thing. This is where it's handy to have a dad who studies slavery. Right. Is that when my dad, I'll be sort of dealing with the day to day of the AI news and some piece of and this, that, and the other, and then my dad will come to me and say, boy, this sounds like how the American South was talking about slavery once upon a time. And I'll say, oh, what do you mean? And he's like, well, we love in this country the dream of not working. But boy, does that smack of what inspired slavery once upon a time. I mean, the promise of slavery was you can just relax in your gardens while the slaves take care of the work. Right. I mean, that was the promise. And we are back in that kind of talk now. Now, are these things morally equal? No. But do we have the restraint in our minds to recognize when we are how we will do almost anything to go, how irresistible that marketing pitch is? No, we are not good at recognizing that. And so I think that anyone educated in Ireland would know, one guy with $1 billion in a town, that's a problem. That can go really, really wrong, But in the U.S., we don't have enough experience, I think, to recognize, to know the historical lessons of something like that. Because and it ends up sounding like, wow, that sounds great. What a great idea. We should be doing that. So there's some real sort of adolescent naivete around this as well, I would say.
For sure. So, you mentioned earlier about one of the core ideas in the loop, maybe the central thesis, is that in the same way that Google Maps has deteriorated our sense of direction, that these models are essentially going to deteriorate our decision-making apparatus. A two-part question here. In your mind, what is a decision, right? Let's just establish what we're talking about here. And the second part is, like, how can we go against the current here? How can we make sure that our decision-making apparatus doesn't deteriorate?
Great. These are great questions. If we can figure this out in one podcast, we will really have done something. I guess, so what is a decision? The way I've come to think about it, based on the last 20 years of my career, is that there are a whole bunch of choices that we make day to day that I don't think really count as decisions, because they're just automatic, pattern-based, instinctive choices that a part of our brain that doesn't consult us consciously is running for us. Basically, for the vast majority of our days, we are on autopilot, and I don't consider autopilot to be a series of decisions in the same way that I think about this rare instance in which we actually engage our critical faculties and make a choice. So the Daniel Kahneman way of thinking of this is there's a fast thinking brain. That's your ancient instinctive pattern-based system that's your autopilot. And then there's your slow thinking brain, what he would also call system 2. And that is a system that really it's basically only it's like a fact checker, or like how would you describe it? It's like a system that gets woken up every so often by the autopilot and says, I've got a situation I don't know what to do with here, Commander. Tell me what I should be doing here. And that's where the system 2 has to like slap itself awake and say, okay, let's see what's happening here. My taxes. Okay, I got to deal with these. Okay, shoot. Or, oh, wow, I've been arrested. Oh, geez, what am I going to do here? That's where your pattern-based system doesn't have the shortcut that your brain would need to just handle it. The difference, the best way that I've found to describe this difference is that when I drive my kids to school, for instance, right, I do this same route every day. And if I'm called upon one morning to do something different, take them to the dentist, for instance, very often I will accidentally drive them to school. I'm sure anyone who drives will recognize this idea of just like zoning out and then being like, oh, wow, I made a wrong turn, or, oh, wow, I went to the wrong place. And you come to in the parking lot and just be like, where am I? Oh, I'm at school. Oh, I've got to go to the dentist. And the fact that your brain can do that, can have driven this death box through a world of death boxes, right? And get you to this place without killing you, and you don't even know how you got there, basically. That's autopilot. That's not a set of decisions. When I have to go and drive in your part of the world, right? When I've had to drive in England, which I had to do recently, you don't get to zone out. Like, there's no losing your way. There's no going on autopilot. Every turn of the wheel is an incredibly exhausting and engaging mental task, and those are decisions, right? That's where you are thinking it through as you go. And so, while I don't think we should be making those kinds of decisions all the time, because we would be exhausted, we'd never get anything done. We would have to go to bed mid-morning. That capacity to make decisions in that way is what gives us art and justice and innovation. Like, these are the things that are our higher human functions that we take pride in as a species, are all based on that. And the problem with the way that AI is going to work is that it's going to make it's going to make it such that anytime you bump into one of those harder, slower thinking decisions, you're going to say, Claude, what should I do? ChatGPT, what should I do here? Right? Because your brain doesn't want to do it. And if it can do autopilot, it will. So this prosthetic system 2 is going to be available to us all in a way that I think is really it can be really problematic. So that's how I define decisions and why I'm worried about what AI is going to do to them. Now, how do we protect those decisions? Oh, God. Well, one thing is, I think we have to make those who deal in our behavior liable for not just the individual effects, but the systemic and social effects of changing our behavior. So here's an example of that. Here in the United States, we have begun to sue social media companies for the effects on kids, typically, of the design decisions that those companies have made. So, right, we've had now 2 verdicts come down in the United States that are big, big deals. One of which charged Meta with facilitating sexual exploitation of kids. The other one accused Meta and YouTube of creating addictive design. And in both cases, those companies lost. And it opens the floodgates to a huge set of new lawsuits that are about to come down the pipeline at them. They've got like 1,600 cases coming their way to the tune of what could be hundreds of billions of dollars in losses and could rewrite the rules completely. And the reason that that is notable in my world is in the United States, we have really only ever thought about 2 kinds of harm: financial harm and physical harm. Death and theft we care about in this country and we regulate against. But never before, I would argue, have we at this level recognized behavioral harm at scale, the effect on people's choices as a thing that companies should be responsible for when they mess with those. And so I think that there's this impulse for us to say, well, we need to be better. We as humans individually need to do a better job of like making better choices, and we need to be better educated. You love, the tech companies love to say that it's somehow on us to make better choices. But what I think actually needs to happen is we need to start treating the messing with our choices as being the same as messing with our food or messing with the safety systems in our cars or, pollution, right? Things that carry real legal consequences. And so for me, that's the first step. And the good news, I think, is that we are already, at least in the United States, moving much faster than we ever did in the social media era to try to sue when there's a problem. Already we're having the families of kids who have fallen into psychosis using chatbots and in some cases have attempted to take their own lives or maybe even have. Those families are suing. And the evidence chain is pretty clear and it's pretty, we're starting to understand that. So for me, it's something about there's the how do we as individuals protect our own decision making? We should talk about that. But I think that's got to be secondary to making it such that when you do mess with people's decision making as a company, you are taking on a huge amount of legal liability so that they are incentivized not to just mess with our brains.
That's a very, very good point. You can work hard at this as an individual, but if the systems around you are nudging you a certain way, it's an uphill battle the whole time,
Right. I mean, one of the, I'm not familiar with what the most recent turn of the wheel is where you are, but here in the United States, we've just like openly legalized sports gambling on your phone. You can place bets on not just on sports, but we also now have these prediction markets where you can place bets on kind of anything, on like the outcome of a political race and how long the press conference that Trump's going to give is going to run. I mean, literally, like these prediction markets let you bet on anything, and there's this. So I'm a former drinker, as I mentioned. I had to quit drinking. One of the first things you learn when you quit drinking is you can't go into bars anymore. You're not going to go in there because, as I have come to understand from the researchers I've spoken to, your decision-making apparatus takes its cues from its environment. So when you're in a bar, your brain goes, what do we do in bars? Yay, we drink. Let's drink, So you don't go into bars. Like you wouldn't do that. But what people who have a gambling problem have told me is that now that this stuff is legal on their phone, it is the equivalent of having a fifth of whiskey in your back pocket all the time as a drinker. You're not, you can't, and your job requires you to carry this freaking thing with you all the time. It'd be like me being forced to carry booze around with me all the time. And so the illusion when you say, so you'll see the ads for these companies, FanDuel and Sports Kings, and all these various people, DraftKings, sorry, and the Kalshi, the prediction markets and all that stuff. And they'll always say at the bottom of them, gamble responsibly or play responsibly, as if it's your freaking problem. right? That it's you, that you have to make better choices around this stuff. But, any recovery expert would tell you that the number one thing you should do is drown this thing in the bathtub, right? But you can't. And so, it's just, I think whenever people say like, oh, well, we need to make better choices, I always say, there is an army of the smartest behavioral scientists in the world employed by these companies trying to shape your choices. The idea that some parent is going to somehow have the capacity to protect their family against the work that those people are doing day in and day out to the tune of billions of dollars, is unrealistic. So I do think we need to put a huge amount of responsibility on the companies dealing in this stuff rather than trying to say it's our responsibility.
Yeah. Well, like when you ask the question, what good can come from that kind of legislation? It's just like, apart from the profit of those gambling companies, like that is just no good can come, no societal benefit can come from that. And it's,
I know, the real problem here in the U.S. is that we are, we're such a large country. It's very expensive to run a country this big, and yet our taxes are very low as compared to the rest of the world. And so one of the things that has really compromised the state governments in thinking about this clearly is that they take huge amounts of tax revenue from these gambling sites. When you legalize sports gambling in a state, you get a chunk of the payout, and those revenues are enormous. So when Colorado first, I think they were like second or third maybe, but they were when they legalized sports gambling, they were suddenly taking in like tens of millions of dollars a week in as just a small percentage of the total. They're taking in huge amounts of money. Simultaneously, I remember I was reading what was the number one thing that people were watching and betting on at that time. The top thing that people were betting on was Russian ping pong. And you think, well, who's a fan of Russian ping pong? The answer is nobody's a fan of Russian ping pong. Russian ping pong is just the thing that's on at 2 a.m. So, and now in Russia, there are these whole sports farms, they call them, where regular people are playing like random tiddlywinks and chess and anything else. So you can just have a thing to bet on all the time, right? Like it's the ultimate predatory system, but it's very difficult for a state administrator to resist the call of that, considering that they're suddenly going to make up a huge shortfall in their education budget or a huge shortfall in their road repair budget. So that's a tough one. That's a really tough one.
Yeah, like I've been thinking recently about, where are my AI boundaries? What are the things I am 100% not going to outsource to AI? So for example, a couple of years ago, I wrote a blog post on the concept of it was on the science of non-duality and that sort of view of consciousness, and that took me about a month to write. I'm researching the topic, and going really in deep with these ideas. And when you do that sort of thing, it changes the way you look at the world a little bit, and that's really, really beneficial. Now, I could have spent 10 minutes and prompted ChatGPT to create a better post, but at the end of the day, it's sort of like, I want the process and the difficulty of having to do that in the same way that I don't want to get a taxi to the end of a marathon. I want to actually go through the thing, So I think it's so important for people nowadays to decide, I will just 100% not outsource this specific aspect of my life to AI.
Yeah. And I think everybody's going to have to come to their own place of comfort around it. But I think one thing that has been helpful to me, I was talking to an expert in this stuff, and she was making the good point that our capacity to do this stuff, to like draw or write jokes or, create a play or any of that kind of stuff, it's a muscle. And it's not a computer that you can turn off, put away in a closet, and then take out in a couple of years and turn back on, and it'll do the same thing. That's not how our skills work. So if there's any skill that you enjoy or that has ancillary benefit for you, for me, right, one of the number one things that for me is both the most satisfying and the most, I would argue, kind of sort of that fills me with life is my horrible attempts to speak other languages. Me butchering Spanish, right, is incredibly valuable for me, for my brain, for my confidence, for my experiences. It makes life longer, the experience of going to another country and trying to like just get through a day in another language. Now, I could very easily just hold up my phone, right? All of these companies are trying to say like, you should just speak into the phone, just hold it up and that'll do it. And I've been in places where that's the case. I've seen people get through, and in an emergency, it's a great thing. I'm glad that thing exists. But but the science has shown us that the action of trying to learn a new language is so good for our own neuroplasticity, and it deepens your understanding of other cultures. It reduces your bias around people. Like, it's incredibly beneficial. So yeah, these things we each have to decide for ourselves, like, what is a thing that has been valuable, that has felt valuable to me, and defend it, because I mean, there are many, many, many things that we could make more efficient. And these companies are all about trying to make these things efficient, and especially trying to make things efficient that we are irresistible to that we can't resist using, that we're going to make a habit out of. And so your instincts, this let the computer do it instinct, is not going to be a good guide as to what you should defend. Instead, we have to have these, and it's in conversation, I think, that we'll find these for the most part, right? You and me talking to each other thousands of miles apart are helping each other see, like, oh yeah, that's a thing. Like, I was like, this language thing is something I'm just bumping into as we're talking here. Like, I care about that. Oh, right. I'm not going to just give that up. I'm not going to give that away because there's something positive for me there. So yeah, I think it's going to be, each person's going to have their own kind of, their own negotiation with themselves about that. But just because they can make that thing more efficient doesn't mean that you should use that thing, is the lesson.
For sure. I'm with you on the butchering other languages.
Yeah.
It's so much fun.
Yeah, right. I mean, what's yours? What for you? Tell me one of those.
So in Dublin, there's a big Brazilian community here, and so every day I have interactions with people from Brazil. So I'm sort of gradually learning Portuguese.
Oh, that's so cool.
But it's all through interactions with people that I, would buy my lunch from and buy coffees from. And it's an amazing way to connect with people as well. They appreciate it so much if you even just make a tiny effort,
Yeah, it's you get so much out of it, right? That warmth and the appreciation and the fact that you are the one making the bridge possible is such a big thing. Like whenever I've been in a position where I speak their language better than they speak mine, which is rare. Let me tell you, that doesn't happen very often. But when it does, I'm so proud of myself. It feels so good, So these are things that companies want to do away with. They're going to say, yeah, you don't have to do that. Don't worry about it. We'll take it from here. And I think just because you can do it, and just because it'll be easier, and just because someone will charge you a little money to get that done for you, doesn't mean you should do that thing. That's right.
I think the best life hack I've picked up in the past few years is learning thank you in as many languages as possible. So say someone from Romania is serving me coffee or whatever, and I where are you from? Romania. And then at the end I'm like, mulțumesc, and they're just like,
whoa, good. That's great. That's a good one. Yeah, I've always wanted to say, because I'm 2 meters tall. I'm 6'7". I've always wanted to be able to make like at least one height joke in every language. Like if I could just be like, yeah, I'm pretty freakish, or if I could say, yeah, I'm pretty freakish in every language, that would get me very far, I think.
For sure. Okay, so on a less cheery note, what are your thoughts on Nita Faraday's thesis in the battle for your brain?
Yeah,
so give people a brief intro to that as well.
Yeah, I love that. So Nita has become a friend because we have such sort of common thinkings about this stuff. So for anybody who doesn't know, Nita Farahany is a law professor at the at Duke University in the United States, and she has written a book called The Battle for Your Brain, which is all about what she described, a lot of what I've been talking about here. She, as a lawyer, as a legal thinker, a legal scholar, is trying to put into terms that are truly sort of defensible in court, whereas I'm much more kind of namby-pamby about it. She's very, wishy-washy about it. She's got this very firm sort of legal construct, and she calls it cognitive liberty, and the idea that we should be free to make choices without influence wherever possible. And she has a great Substack I think called Thinking Freely, I think she calls it, but she has a whole thing. It's free for anybody who wants to read it. That's her law class about AI and AI's effect on our brains. And so, what she and I have connected on, I've had her on my podcast a couple of times, and I tell everybody about her. I feel like I quote her every day. She, I think, has really come up with a really smart way of just thinking about some of these themes that you and I are talking about, and that she's the nice thing about her is that she believes there is, she, like me, she believes there is a path to walk with these tools, that they can be very, very useful. But she is also trying to enshrine some liability. And what she's done a great job with, the Battle for Your Brain even kind of predated AI in the same way my book did. Hers was about companies that are trying to get sensors onto your skin, the Aura rings and the Meta glasses and all of these folks trying to get you to, your Apple Watch. Those folks are the people making those are trying to gain as much data about you as possible, and they're trying to really get up against your skin and get your sleep cycles and when you're sick and where you're going, like understanding you at a cellular level. And she and what she has predicted, and it turns out is coming true, is that people are beginning to use that stuff to evaluate you for not just like your health insurance, but also, which in the United States is something that a company cannot give you or can charge you kind of whatever they want for. And so if you are shown through your watch to be, prone to this or that disease, they can mess with your insurance rates that way, maybe even deny you. All the way through to, in China, there are these systems now where people wear these special hats at work, and the hat will tell your boss whether or not you're focused, whether you're in a state of focus or not. And if you're not focused, they're not going to pay you. It's that kind of stuff. And so her whole thing is, if she and I both agree that, like, it's not the technology. That's not the problem. It's the incentive structure. That's the problem, right? The money is what ruins everything. And so it's not that these systems in and of themselves are bad, or in my case, I think AI has incredibly positive uses. They just tend to be uses that don't make anybody any money. And when you do start to try and make money off of this stuff, you very quickly begin mining into some really sensitive human stuff that can wind up at its worst being manipulative and even destructive. And so for her, she's trying to cordon that off legally in a way that I really applaud.
Beautiful. What do you think are the most beneficial potential uses of artificial intelligence, both individually and collectively?
Well, I mean, there's just so much incredible discovery that we can do. What I want to do is just give I just want there to be a whole academic class. Class is the wrong word here, but like a strata of expertise that should just get like unlimited compute, right? Like right now, the thing that's throttling people's use of this stuff is how expensive it is to crunch to do what they call the inference, the asking questions and getting it out of a computer, right? That stuff is expensive. And hundreds of millions of dollars a week are being spent on silly stuff, and meanwhile, academics could use this for incredible things. So there's a great example. So it's at its core, these systems are pattern recognition systems. So you point them at the stars. I mean, once upon a time, they literally had to, you had to have graduate students look at two pictures of the cosmos and look back and forth between them and see if anything's different and be like, oh, look, this star moved a little, like that's how they used to do that, right? You aim a modern transformer model at that, it can parse it can find the patterns in that incredibly quickly. You show it endless pictures of somebody's back with a mole on it, and it can tell you which one is going to be most likely to be cancerous, right? It can do incredible stuff. And so for me, there are some places where that, crosses over into a world where you can make some money. And that tends to be medical, although that can get exploitative pretty quick too. But, there's an amazing project that's still underway called the Vesuvius Challenge. And it is this, basically in 79 AD, when Vesuvius exploded and entombed the people of Pompeii, it also entombed this villa near Herculaneum that had been owned by Julius Caesar's father-in-law. And he had kept he was the patron of a guy, Philodemus of Garda. I don't know. I'm not a classics guy, but anyway, this particular philosopher lived there for a time, and he had this big library. And the trouble with ancient libraries is that none of that stuff survives the Mediterranean climate. But in this case, all these scrolls in this shelving were entombed by volcanic material and preserved as a result. But they were preserved in scroll form. And so when they unearthed this thing in the 19th century, they discovered all these scrolls and they were very excited. And they tried to open a couple of them and they destroyed them in the process because there's no way to do this. These things are just basically made out of flint now. So what it turns out you can do now is, using a laser-based system and AI, you can scan the frickin' thing and virtually unroll it, and then looking at just the incredibly, microscopic difference between the surface of the paper and the place where the ink is, all of which is covered in rock, they can read the frickin' things now. And they've found undiscovered histories of Alexander the Great and his descendants. They know now where Plato was buried based on that. They found the burial site of Plato because it was written in these scrolls, which we would never have known. That shit's awesome. So I'm like, go academics, run with the AI, right? No one's making money off of where Plato's buried, right? No one's making money off of figuring out which apartments should be stripped of lead paint. No one's figuring out figuring out the patterns by which police accidentally kill people is not a money-making enterprise. But these are great uses of this stuff. And so I'm a huge fan of using AI for that kind of thing. I just think we shouldn't be using it to make frickin' virtual girlfriends or, any of this other creepy stuff that makes you immediate money. And the problem right now is that this whole $1 billion one-person company craze means that the people doing investment on this stuff, they want their money back really quick. They no longer have the patience for a couple of years of runway before you start making money. They want you to be profitable immediately, which is why everybody's, using this stuff for the dumbest possible purpose, the dumbest possible money-making purpose, and not using it to, scan scrolls or the cosmos.
Well, I think that leads me well into the last question. Let's say by some crazy turn of events, the White House suddenly, they became rational and they were like, right, we really need to think this AI problem through here. Jacob, we want you to come in. We want you to advise us on how can we create the conditions societally? What regulations do we need to put in place? So this is going to lead to the long-term flourishing of as many people as possible in our society, and it's not going to go really south. Yeah.
Wow. Well, White House, I'm available. Give me a call. That would be crazy if they did call me up. Well, the first thing we would need to do, I think, in this country is establish an apprenticeship program. We need a system where young people coming out of college are guaranteed an income for learning the fundamentals of a professional life. And that's because we have already seen, so I live in the San Francisco Bay Area in California, where, already people are, highly skilled people are being laid off by the thousands because their jobs can be done by AI. That is clear. It's just clearly and openly happening now. And the thing that I keep trying to articulate to anybody who will listen is that if you do away with the entry-level positions, the first couple of positions, first of all, it's going to decimate life for, in particular, non-college educated women. This is a point that was made by a researcher at the Brookings Institute who I really respect for this. And she was just pointing out, the great jobs for people who don't have a college education, for women who don't have a college education, have traditionally been executive assistant, bookkeeping, clerical, admin. And these are the jobs that these companies are wiping out with this stuff. You're never going to want to pay for an intern or an admin again, because why would you need that? The system can answer your email and the rest of it, right? But what we're going to be depriving ourselves of is the ability to create people who can work with other people solve a complex problem in a team, make a difficult sale, some of the really important jobs, think critically about what the company should do strategically. Like, these are some really core skills that are going to get wiped out if we don't protect those, the window that young people have for learning that stuff. And so I think we're going to need a program where young people are coming to a professional environment and shadowing the people that you're going to want them to be in 3 years. When you need a middle manager capable of complex decision making, if we don't do that, in 3 or 4 years, you're not going to have anybody qualified to do that. You're going to have people with no skills that you're going to want to hire into advanced roles. We don't have that. And so I think that that's one of the first things, is I would want to establish a national apprenticeship program for that kind of stuff. I also would say that because, according to the World Economic Forum and everybody else who's tracking what people say they want out of people in an AI world, is creative thinking, critical thinking, right? That the capacity to engage that system two, that slow thinking brain, is the thing that everyone is saying they're going to need, because the instinctive stuff is going to get taken care of now by this system in theory. And so, I think we're in a world in which you're going to need to do something like, this is a politically toxic thing to say in the United States, but like, it needs to be like the New Deal. It needs to be like the Roosevelt administration in the United States, coming out of the Depression, created the Works Progress Administration, where artists and writers and playwrights and so forth were employed by the government to do creative work. And it created this, a whole creative renaissance in the United States, and kept alive all of these intellectual traditions that are really important, it turns out. And right now, I think we have over-indexed so far over into what we in this country call STEM. I don't know if that's an international term, but science, technology, right? Engineering and math. We have over-indexed on output, technical skill kind of work, to the detriment of art and music and language and everything else that we should be teaching. And so I think that we got to protect that stuff, because it's going to go away if we now that we've led everybody down this one-way street to this cul-de-sac in which everyone's supposed to be gaining all of these coding skills and engineering skills and so forth, and now those are all useless. You then have a whole generation of people who don't have the critical thinking skills that you're going to really want out of people in the future. And the best path to that stuff is is history and art and music and, creative collaboration kind of work. So we're going to need to enshrine that nationally, I think, because the market's not going to take care of it. So that's my totally politically toxic dream for the United States. Yeah, trying to get me in front of a Trump administration official making that case. Holy geez, no way. But that would be my dream.
I love it. Okay, Jacob, I've really enjoyed this conversation. Where can people find you online, learn more about your work, and get your book?
Well, this has been a wonderful experience. I really appreciate it. So I post more or less every day at theripcurrent.com. I have a Substack and podcast that lives there. People can get me on YouTube. For some reason, I don't know why, but I get the most traction on TikTok. I have a huge following. Not a huge, but for me, my biggest following is TikTok. And that's been a really interesting place to be. And then the book is called The Loop: How AI is Creating a World Without Choices and How to Fight Back. It came out in 2022, but it's in print. You're welcome to grab it. And I'll be curious to see what people think, whether they think I got it right or wrong. So, Neil, thank you so much for this time. I really appreciate this thoughtful conversation.
My pleasure, Jacob. Thank you. If you enjoyed this episode, you might also enjoy getting our 7 Insights newsletter. This is a once per month email where I share 7 of the most valuable insights I've uncovered in the previous 30 days. It includes book, podcast, and documentary recommendations, as well as questions and quotes specifically curated to help you live a more creative, intentional, and meaningful life. It currently goes out to over 50,000 subscribers each month. And if you're interested in joining them, you can sign up via the link in the description.